The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest edition of our Provoke Media CCO Podcast. And I'm here with Leslie Cafferty from Booking Holdings. And we're going to be talking a little bit about her role at Booking, the travel industry in general, and how that's been going, and some of the new technology applications that are part of the marketing and communication strategy at Booking. But why don't you start, Leslie, by telling us a little bit about Booking Holdings, which is probably better known under two or three different names than it is as the holding company.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Paul. Excited to have this conversation today. But yeah, Booking Holdings is maybe not a household name for many, but it is one of the biggest internet tech companies in the world. And we operate mostly online travel brands. So Booking.com, Kayak, Priceline, Agoda, which is largely based in Asia, but we also own OpenTable. And then a number of smaller brands. So largely online travel. And within that, Booking.com is our biggest business. They're European based in Amsterdam, but now very, very global company. But that's Booking Holdings in a nutshell.
So if we can just stick with that for a moment, and tell me about how that impacts your role. How much of your time is spent focused on sort of the corporate reputation of Booking Holdings, and how much of it is making sure that the brands are prominent and active and visible?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's evolved a little bit. So when I joined the company at the Booking Holdings level, the way we were structured was I spent probably the majority of my time working, thinking about Booking Holdings and the corporate reputation. And then within each of the brands, we had communications teams that were focused on driving sort of the positive and the consumer. We've evolved a little bit. That structure still holds place, and there's sort of dotted line reporting between the brands and Booking Holdings, and then within their own brand. That's evolved a little bit because where we are today as a company, I mentioned Booking.com is the biggest business. So what we have is a business that's about 90% of the company. And when you say Booking.com, sometimes people don't leave the .com, or Booking Holdings, you don't say the holdings. So kind of Booking becomes the name. So it's almost one and the same a little bit. So we've, as a company, not just in communications, but as a company, we've structured a little bit differently that if you have a Booking Holdings role, more often than not in most functions, you also now directly run the Booking.com function. So the other brands will dotted line into me, and then I will manage the Booking Holdings corporate team and the Booking.com team. And then within that, we still also, there's a balance between, because again, if you have a corporate reputation issue and it just says Booking, did X, Y, and Z, it doesn't really matter whether it was Booking.com from a consumer reputation perspective, it's Booking. So that's a bit how we're structured. And I spend probably more of my time on the corporate reputation, crisis, incidents. And then we have a team that is also looking, obviously, how to circumvent that, is driving all of the positive brand awareness and reputation globally.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because I think one of the conversations that's been ongoing when I talk to CCOs over the last year or so is that balance between protect and promote. And it tends to be protect at the corporate level and then promote at the brand level. And I assume that's sort of similar to how your role has evolved.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. Definitely protect. And, the protect is in the immediate. And then how do you, always looking forward and ahead about what could potentially come around the corner, making sure you're prepared for that. And then the promote piece of things is a much more, it's less, it's certainly strategic, but it's it has a more linear planning process probably to it than sometimes the corporate reputation side of things, which is not always in the planning. So I think there's probably an element of chief communications officers needing to spend a lot of their time focused on that piece.
Right. Let's backtrack a little bit and talk a little about how you arrived at this role, because you've been with the company for quite a while, right?
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about sort of your career path and how you got to the top job there.
Yeah, so I had no, communications was not on my radar at all. I studied international relations in college. Interestingly enough, I come from a little bit of a related background. My father was a journalist, so there was sort of media around the edges. I had absolutely no interest in following his career path on that side. But fast forward, the first job I landed was at a company called IAC. And again, similar to maybe Booking Holdings, not a household name, but they owned a conglomerate of big internet brands that people would know, Match.com, Vimeo, City Search at the time. So a big, big internet company. And there was an opening in their communications function. And what I sort of learned at the time was business wasn't really on my radar, but I found this business, the internet business, technology, and how this business was being run really, really interesting. And the company was quite high profile, in the news a lot, making lots of acquisitions. So I was also getting some visibility into what this communications team did. And it was really interesting. And so a role opened up there, and I didn't get it because they told me I had no communications experience. So that was that. And 6 months later, they still hadn't filled the role. So I put my hand up again, and they gave me a shot. So I spent 8 years at IAC, moving my way up, learning everything from driving consumer brands, loving the pace of technology, being in a technology company, corporate and crisis issues. We were sued by shareholders. We had a lot of things happening. We did mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, spin-offs. So the gamut of corporate and consumer just was all thrown at me at once. It was an incredible learning experience. So that was my start. I left after a while to try something new, and I went to Nielsen, the global sort of TV ratings company. I was on that side of the business. I spent a few years there, and I think my biggest learnings were I loved the pace of technology and technology companies and how they worked. And I loved the element of a multi-brand company because it kept things really interesting. And so when Booking Holdings at the time actually was just Priceline, called me. They still owned all these entities, but the name was different. The two things that I really missed about IAC were there was going back to a tech company and going back to a global multi-brand company. So I joined 12 years ago, and the company has seen phenomenal growth. And so, every year I sort of say, okay, what else can I do? Am I done? And then something new turns the corner, and there's a new challenge and opportunity ahead. So that's a little bit about how I got here. Yeah.
Let's just stay for a moment with your international affairs background. I wonder whether that has become more relevant over the last year or so as geopolitics has begun to sort of impact a whole bunch of corporate affairs and communications issues.
Absolutely. It's you can't separate. It's becoming increasingly impossible, right, to separate anything. And I think the global experience has been critical. Understanding cultural nuances, how you communicate in different markets, how a message or a company point of view would be received in one part of the world versus another part of the world. If you don't have a good understanding, and, even as a chief communications officer, I'm not the expert in every region, right? But understanding that where I need to have team members who have expertise there, you can make companies can make a big mistake if you are not really savvy to what's happening in the world and how a message that you need to send will resonate, or how that will be received in a certain area. So it's critically important. And I would say for anyone in this role, to be really cautious and mindful of, if you don't have that expertise, making sure that you're building that as a muscle to make sure that you have on your team. I think it's critical in today's world, and probably not something that's ever going to be reversed at this stage.
Yeah, I suspect that's true. And how do you sort of structure the whole communications and sort of function that you have there? You alluded a little bit to the different brands and the dotted line that they have to Booking Holdings. But
Yeah.
sort of how many people do you have on the ground and how widespread is your team and how do agencies fit into that?
Sure. So I think if you look across Booking Holdings, it's always in flux, but I would say we are probably about 100 people on the ground. And I would say within that, about 60% of those people work for Booking.com, being the biggest brand. And then the other 40% would be dispersed across the different brands. And then when you look at structure and function, most of the teams, so I'll take the Booking.com team as the biggest, but it mirrors itself across the other brands. We'll have people focused on, corporate and crisis issues. You have teams focused on consumer. That's going back to the promotion piece, right, that we talked about earlier. Teams focused on product communications, of course, internal communications, and then also regionally based. So I think about half the people are sort of in the headquarters, and then the other half are dispersed in region, right? Again, going to that local expertise. And when you're dealing, especially in media relations, you have to have local language experience. You have to understand the market. So we're divided a little bit across those functions within communications, and then a balance between centrally led functions and then people within the regions.
Right. And obviously, all of the brands that you mention live online, right? They are .com brands in one way or another. Does that mean that social media is a greater part of your time than sort of legacy, mainstream, traditional, whatever we're calling it nowadays, media?
Yeah.
And has that always been the case?
I think it's a good question, and I think social media is incredibly important. But when I look in totality, there are so many channels we use because we serve so many different audiences. So we are a global publicly traded company. So we have investors, right, that are paying attention to what we're communicating. And so how we reach investors, tried and true press release is actually still, that's the first way they get access to our news. If we issue a press release, it's in auto in their inbox. So we will still use that for corporate sort of reputation and management and business topics. We are still looking at traditional media. Now, whether that's, the wallstreetjournal.com or the physical paper, a bit one and the same. It depends on how the consumer, but, traditional media still serves a very important base of audience for us, the business community, even the tech community. But when we think about our customers, we definitely are thinking social media, but also traditional media in the sense, but less business focused, more consumer lifestyle focused, right? So for travel companies, talking about travel and leisure, a more traditional, but they also have an online presence. But to social media specifically, it is definitely becoming a bigger and bigger piece. As our consumer audience is becoming more and more digital, younger generations, that's even now where many of them get their news. So it's not even going to, NewYorkTimes.com or travelandleisure.com. It might be what New York Times posted on Facebook or X or, et cetera. So I think the most important thing, and to your question, has it changed over time? It's constantly changing. And I think that's one of the most important pieces of our job is to constantly look, who is our audience? Where are they? Where are they getting their information? And are we there? And so how we tailor a message across those different channels for those different audiences may be a little bit unique, but we have to be conscious of where our customers are and make sure we're there. Otherwise, we're speaking into a vacuum.
Right. I should actually take a step back maybe and just get a sense of the scope of your role there and which stakeholders you're responsible for. You mentioned the financial community and a lot of CCO jobs don't include the financial community to the same extent that they do employees and customers and communities. What's the scope of the role there?
So we do have a dedicated investor relations team that sort of is the primary look into the our investor community and the financial community, but we very much play an active role. If we are even putting out, I have to be mindful, let's say we're putting out a product release about a new, generative AI function that we have across one of our brands. So you think usually through the lens of we want our consumers to know that we have this great new product. So, you push that message out. But that, one of the biggest topics top of mind among our investors is what is the impact of generative AI on, big tech companies like us. So while we may think that is a press release or a message or communication for consumers, actually one of the biggest, a group of questions will come from our investors. So we have to be mindful as communicators all the time that even if we intend for a message to land with one particular audience, once you put it out there, whether it's on social media or whether it's traditional media or whether it's anywhere else, other audiences will see it. And so you have to think through the lens of, are we preparing for the questions that will come from those other audiences, including the financial community?
Right. This question may inevitably lead us into the discussion of AI that I think is pretty much inevitable in any discussion around communications. But data and analytics have become more important in campaign planning and in campaign measurement over the last few years. Tell me a little bit about how you've seen the use of data change over the last few years.
Yeah, we are a very, very data-driven company. At the core of how all these brands were built. I think when you're an internet company, you have so much that you can tangibly measure and look at in real time. The DNA of our company is very data-driven. And so it's unacceptable to come in and, say, well, we don't have data to really, really measure what we do. So we have to constantly look and think creatively about how do we measure. And I think there's so many aspects of measurement that we're constantly thinking about. And it varies depending on what we're looking at. So if I use social media, for example, that's a channel that's actually much easier to look at some specific metrics. If we put a message out on Instagram or TikTok, we can instantly see how many people are engaging with it. What is the sentiment of the comments that they're coming back? How many people are liking it? You can have data and analytics because it's all tracked online with a footprint of how many people you actually reached, how many people viewed your video, if it's a video, et cetera. So social media is I love that as a channel because it's very measurable. You can see instantly, did you achieve what you were looking to achieve or not? When it comes to traditional media, and we're constantly trying to drive a lot of positive earned media, we don't have access to those metrics, right? So we don't know how many people may have seen the great article on, travelandleisure.com because we don't have those metrics. Those are their metrics. So it's much harder to look at. But one of the ways we think about it with campaigns is we say, if we have a budget for a campaign, we say, okay, our budget is X and we want to achieve a certain number of stories, of positive stories within this budget. So we now measure, we launch the campaign, we see how many stories we get, and then we divide that by the budget. And we sort of see how much did it cost, did each article sort of cost within that budget. And we've been doing that for many years because, what's good, what's bad is hard to tell. But we've been doing that for so many years that now we've created some benchmark sort of, we have a sense for, well, if we're going to spend, I'll just use silly numbers for the sake of it. If I'm going to spend $100 on a campaign and I get 100 stories, that's kind of $1 per story is what it cost us. And over time, when you launch different campaigns and you see what that metric looks like, you start to get a sense for, was that successful or not? If we spend on our next campaign, if we spend $100 and we only get 2 articles, then you sort of look at that and said, well, that was about $50 an article. So that the ROI is not there. So it's measuring in a very different way. We're not actually capturing how many people read it or how many eyeballs it reached because we don't have that data, but we have to think creatively about how do we get a sense for understanding, is our money being put to good, effective use?
And is it the case that you've sort of developed a sense of which media work best for which kind of stories? In other words, do you get a different level of engagement on Insta than you do on X, for example, for different kind of messages? Or how do you decide where you're going to focus your energy for a particular kind of story or even a particular brand?
Yeah, it's a great question. So take Open Table, for example. Actually, for all of our brands, just to step back for a second, we really have two critical audiences. We have the customers who are buying the product, right? But then we also have the partners who are supplying everything to our website. So in Open Table's example, it's the restaurants, right? We want the customers to use the product, but we also need those restaurants to make themselves available. We want customers to find all the restaurants they can. So if you look at Open Table as an example, when they are thinking about their overarching communication strategy, they want to be reaching both audiences. So if you look at some of the food blogs or the niche food trade publications that maybe you're not reading, or the masses aren't reading, they have small viewership. Those publications are incredibly important for Open Table to reach their potential dining partners, to help recruit additional restaurants, to talk to their restaurants, to send restaurants. So, in some instances, a small publication with not a lot of reach can be incredibly important to achieve your business objectives. And then at the same time, when they want to reach diners, there's mainstream media because, as our CEO says, everybody eats, right? So there's kind of mainstream media. But then if you really want to target, there's lots of food bloggers out there and food influencers on social media. So we definitely look at each brand. Who do we need to reach? And then what are the publications, channels, and outlets that are going to reach those audiences that are going to help ultimately, yes, drive the messages we need to get, but those messages hopefully then helping to drive the business objectives.
Right. And I wanted to talk specifically a little bit about your use of TikTok, and sort of your launch on TikTok. Tell me a little bit about that and how that went and how you prepared for it.
Yeah, that was very fun because we learned a lot, and we learned a lot very quickly in real time. So a few years back, when it was very clear that TikTok was emerging as, a huge, huge platform and attracting tons of eyeballs all over the world, of course, going back to where are our customers, and then we have to be there. So we realized we needed to be on TikTok. We had a pretty scrappy budget, and we had at the time a relatively small team on social media. And we were used to new social channels required things to be slightly different. But if I look at, say, we launched on Facebook, which is an older platform. And then when Instagram came around, we realized that the content couldn't needed to be different on both, but not wildly different. So we would tailor a little, and we had some learnings. So then we thought, okay, here's this new next emerging social media channel, TikTok. We'll just take some of that content and put it on TikTok. And we learned very quickly that what you put on Instagram does not work on TikTok, and vice versa. But again, going back to the data driven mindset, you have these metrics in real time so you can see what works. And one of the best things, I think one of the best aspects of this job sometimes is when you're looking on the promotion side of things and how to tell creative stories, more from a marketing or branding lens. Everybody has ideas on what they think will work. This is going to be the best idea. I love this idea. It's very subjective. And sometimes you can insist this is the best idea. And then you put it out, and then you watch it totally just, dissolve into the ether. So we've come to learn, it's never based on our ideas or what we think is a good idea. It's based on what the audience tells us they like. And what we've learned on TikTok, it's a very entertainment forward platform. So people go there and they have small moments in time and they want to be entertained. And so putting a more traditional brand message or product message, that does not work well. And so we've had to try to get creative to sort of get our message out, promote the brands, but in a way that is seen as entertainment for consumers.
Right. So I'm sort of interested in what you were saying there about being sort of data and audience driven, because it strikes me that there is always a balance between what the data tells you and the personal experience of people on your team who are sort of hopefully immersed in these communities and platforms on a daily basis, and sort of therefore have a very qualitative sort of understanding of what's working and what's not. How do you balance those two things?
I think both are really important and they're very symbiotic. If you have people, absolutely. I look when we were hiring and when we continue to hire on the social media team, you really have to look at, you don't want an academic who has studied and learned what these channels do by reading about them. You want people who are living in these channels, right? Because they know the trends, they know. And so it is, I always say to the team, like, never source an idea from me. But if you need help with ideas, I'm happy to ask my 13-year-old daughter, and she can probably tell me, and I can be the conduit of the message of what's trending on some of these channels. But so having people immersed, they're spotting trends instantly. Trends can come and go within 24 hours, right? So we have people living on the channels. And it's funny, you used to always think, in the workplace, you don't want to walk by desks and see your employees, sitting on Facebook but now we do. I want our social media team to be living in social media, watching what's trending, watching what's working, so we can instantly, that's another great learning we've had. You see a trend coming, and from a more traditional marketing lens, the instinct is, you want a quality piece of content. So you want it very well produced. But we've learned, one, you don't have time for that to capture a trend. And two, scrappier is better on these channels. Most content are people uploading. It's not professionally produced. So that's what people are used to. So now we've gotten in a really good rhythm of spotting the trend, very scrappy, quick production, getting it out, and then hopefully, again, tracking and measuring and seeing. And if it doesn't work, move on to the next thing. If it is, maybe see how we can capitalize on it further.
Yeah, it always seems to me that there's a fine line between sort of being authentic, which sometimes does look gritty and sort of unprofessional, and being overly professional, which can look a little manufactured and a little artificial. And these platforms, again, it seems to me, really value authenticity. They value realness.
Absolutely. And we've had a lot of learnings over the years and a lot of, I get questions sometimes. We'll put, a funny piece of content out. One, I can't even remember exactly what it was, but it was a cow. It was an influencer with a cow. And we brought the cow to a hotel, and it was really kind of quirky. And I'm looking at it going, but my team is insisting that this is going to work. It did end up working. But, I definitely got some questions from the business going, Leslie, that was not on brand. That was what is that? And so you definitely have to balance. And that's again where the beauty of data, I'm able to go back and say, yeah, I realize, cows traditionally haven't been, on brand for us, but this is a huge influencer that has a huge following, and we connected it to so I think we're all evolving in the function, right? To understand, the instinct is to be really polished and on brand, but recognizing that the world is changing and what the consumer expects from us is changing. And so being able to be flexible, take some, I don't want to call it risk. It's not risk per se, but take some, just be a little bit more flexible with your structure and what your brand guidelines are, and making sure you show up well, but you have to show up in the way that people want, or it's seen as, they swipe right by.
Yeah. And let's stick with influencers for a while, because that's an issue that has become increasingly um, challenging, I think, over the last 2 or 3 years. The balance between celebrity influencers. I know you've worked with people like Brooklyn Beckham in the past, and sort of more regular folk influencers, and also, making sure that your influencers don't have a history of, extreme statements or weird positions that can come back and haunt you. So sort of what do you look for in an influencer? And how do you go about making sure that they're sort of vetted in terms of brand hygiene?
It's a great question. And I think it's really more art than science. I think a few things. One, the first piece is diligence, right? So you have an idea for, okay, this is our idea. Who could we work with? These are people that are, connected to this topic, or we think could have. And once you start to get a sense, the first thing is diligence. So we do, thorough look across their social media channels, a thorough look at news. Has any news happened? Like we'll have our legal teams take a look because you have to be, very careful with, you're inevitably giving up some control of your brand to somebody outside of your company. So diligence is just the first, baseline step. But I think some of the more, on the art versus science learnings that we've come over the years, um, there has to be a connection, some kind of connection. So you have a conversation, with the influencer or the influencer's agent to start. And, do they seem genuinely interested in the project? Because a lot of these influencers, especially the bigger ones, they have a lot of opportunities. And if they're not interested in what we're putting forward, they're not going to be giving it their best. And that will come through at the end of the day. So sometimes, we'll get a yes from somebody that we thought would be great, but you can sense they don't really maybe feel that interested. That's sort of a red flag that we'll consider. One of the other things that we've come to learn is, again, coming back to a more traditional approach where you really want to have control over your brand and how your brand is presented to the world. With influencers, if you try too much to dictate to them, to tell them, and we've learned along the way to say, here's what we want you to say and do, they can do that because you're under, an agreement together, but it doesn't usually work well. The influencers, you have to give them some creative flexibility because they've built a following based on their own personality, the stories that they tell, and how they tell their stories. And so you have to, it's really hard though, again, because you're taking your brand and saying, giving it to this person who doesn't work at your company, hasn't lived your brand the way you do. But they need to have some creative flexibility to be able to tell, you can sort of say, this is kind of what we want you to get across, but then give them the reins to make it resonate with their audience. And I think those are the most successful partnerships that we've seen where we've gone through that partner, the vetting process. They genuinely seem interested. They're users of the product that, whether it's OpenTable or Kayak, like, oh, I love this product. I use it. So there's an interest there, a kind of alignment, and then you give them some creative flexibility. But it's never without, it's always, there's never a guarantee. You definitely lose some control, but you can gain, a ton of awareness and tell your story to different audiences that, you may not have connected with because they've built their own, followings in different places.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that that ability or willingness to give up a little bit of control is the hardest thing about this new environment. Um, and a lot of influencers are essentially amateurs at this stuff. So there's a huge amount of trust that is required.
Yeah.
How do you go about building that? How much work and how much conversation do you have with influencers or creators? I think we're supposed to be calling them creators now.
Yes.
Before you sort of turn them loose on the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we definitely like to, oftentimes depending on their smaller creators, are easier to have conversations with at the outset. When you're working with bigger, more celebrity style, you're in contact with the agent or the agency but we definitely would never sign on anything without, some kind of connection or relationship there. And then we definitely, oftentimes, we will have somebody on site for shooting a piece of content to make sure, we're looking at it, we're engaging, we're building a relationship. We could give feedback, hear their point of view. So it's not just, sign, unleash completely. And then with some influencers, we built great relationships over time again. And it comes back to the ones that truly like our products and use our products. So it feels very authentic when they're telling stories with our products in them. And then many we've worked with for years and years, because it's productive, both ways. They're tapping into our brand to tell stories that their audience likes. And then, we're able to tell stories through these creators to their audiences. But the relationship aspect is important. And if it doesn't work, not everything works perfectly. That's okay. We wouldn't force to work with somebody again just because they may have X followers, right? The relationship there is very important.
Right. I was going to ask you about that because obviously you have worked with sort of profile celebrities. But is there is there a sort of a time when you know it's right to work with somebody who has that kind of profile, and a time when actually you just want somebody who maybe, you know, only has a very defined audience, but they pay attention to everything that they say.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
I think both.
I always thought that the approach of just going to the person with the biggest volume of followers and getting them to say something nice about you in passing was far less effective than finding somebody who, to your point, is a genuine sort of fan of one of your products and working with them more closely in partnership.
I absolutely. And I think we have found we work with all and they work for different reasons. I think if you're going to look at a celebrity, a few things we look at, a celebrity for the sake of celebrity doesn't work. And I think it depends on, obviously, they're going to cost more money. So what is the business priority? If it's the number one priority or number one product of the year, or, if it's a high business priority, that has to be the first, right? And then if you have to look, and I think when we've worked with higher profile celebrities, we found again, it's about the storytelling. So more than just paying them to say something about you, it's really working. So one of the best, most fun, and our audiences combined loved it. We worked with Martha Stewart. I want to say it was a few years ago now, but we were working on promoting our homes product. So you can book, not people know you can book hotels on our properties, but you can also book homes and villas and vacation rentals. And so that's what we were working to promote. And so she has a lot of beautiful homes. So, we had a set, we went to her home and it was an option that you could actually book it and stay. And so that was really fun, but it was more than just, paying to say a message. And we tied into, our products that we wanted to promote was around the home space. And you have to then look at a celebrity that's naturally connected to that topic. So if we went to, I don't know, a basketball player to promote it, the connection is not there. You can pay anyone really famous to say it, but that is very much her world and what she spends her time in. And so her followers, so it was just such a natural. So that's when I think when you really look at the bigger celebrities, you just have to think about the business priority, the alignment between what you're trying to say and where they're focused, and making it something a little bit deeper than just, a message across. But there are so many, you can take the same topic if we're looking to promote our homes. There are some beautiful vacation rentals outside of the major cities in, smaller places all over the world. And so we'll tap into influencers that have massive followings on, I don't know, a beach in somewhere in the south of France, or, and that's how you can also take the same message that you're trying to get, reach different audiences in different places in different ways with smaller creators that have, a smaller following, but very loyal and very in tune.
Right. And I mean, as you said at the outset of the conversation, you're working essentially for a technology company. I assume that for that reason, there's an expectation that you will be sort of on the leading edge of new technologies, and that therefore AI has been a priority for you in recent months and years. How are you looking to AI to help you be faster, better, smarter about what you do here? And what are you sort of optimistic about, and what are you cautious about when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Yes. So we are a technology company, and that is the core of what we do. So AI has been, from just the travel lens tech company perspective, we've been using AI for over a decade. So everything from translations of hotel reviews, in various customer service capacities. So generative AI is now, AI 100.0. And so we are looking at this technology. How can it help the consumer? How can we embed this technology in our products? More people, the rise of users on ChatGPT is just, we've never seen anything like it before. And we know people are searching about travel there. So how is this technology fundamentally going to make the customer experience better? Absolutely something that we're looking at across all brands, across all levels. Within communications, though, within the company, I will step back before I go into communications. Within the company, we have an AI objective, a company objective, which is how are you, every department, every function, and on an individual level, how are you going to leverage AI to do your job better, to make our company better, to work faster, to be more productive, et cetera. So no, just because we are not, we're not technologists in communications, we are not off the hook for being responsible for looking at how this technology can improve. And that's been it is a really fun and exciting journey. So a few ways that we're looking at it, we've built a tool now that if we're helping to prep our executives, for example, if they're going on stage and speaking somewhere and we want to give them a bit of a prep document, we built a tool that can produce that in less than 5 minutes. We're looking at ways we get thousands of inbound media inquiries every week from journalists all over the world asking questions, and that will come to an email mailbox if they don't have individual contact info. It's the first time they're reaching out. And then somebody looks through that and checks them and makes sure we're responding. We're looking now at testing a tool that will automate, that will tell where is this email coming from? The journalist is in what country? Therefore, it needs to get routed to, if it's an inquiry from El País in Spain, that needs to go to our country manager in Spain, right? And so rather than a human checking the inbox all day and forwarding and routing, we're testing something that AI will look at that, recognize who it needs to go to, and it will be instantaneous. And you can take, that work off and put that person on something, more effective. So we're looking at lots of ways that we can test and leverage, not just across the company to help the travelers, but also within our own teams and departments.
And what kind of ethical guardrails do you have in place in terms of either being transparent when you're using Gen AI, or just maintaining authenticity?
Yes, good question. And I think ethical standards are high. We have a whole unit focused on ethical use of AI within the company. So any tool we ever launch or any product that we would launch to consumers, all is vetted by the ethics AI team, which consists of lawyers, technologists, et cetera, to make sure that it's passing all the bar. The other hard thing, challenging thing and great thing as a global company, actual laws and standards for what are required, they vary country by country. So that's also something, if we have to disclose certain things or we want to, or we feel we should, we also need to just make sure we're looking at that on a legal basis, country by country, to make sure we're matching everything. The way we're using it internally now for communications, the examples I gave before, we definitely still have, it's new and early days. So we definitely still have a component of human checking on things. If, our Gen AI tool has produced a briefing document, we're not just going to send that. We're going to look at it. We're still going to make sure that the products it's producing make sense. The last thing you want to do is send a bunch of gibberish to one of your executives.
Well,
So,
the Lloyd
yeah.
story last
Yes.
week was very informative, right? That the tendency to hallucinate is still there,
Yeah.
and you do need to sort of check AI's homework occasionally.
Yes, absolutely. And you have to be very careful with your data. That's another, our company has instilled across all of the brands, very strict standards for which, once you put your company data into one of these big, external LLMs, that's out there. So there's a lot of guardrails, and that's why our tech teams have built our own tools internally that we can use, that we have to be really safe also with our customers' data, right? Our data as a company is our customers' data, our partners' data. So that's another area I think where companies need to be really, really careful to make sure that they're protecting, customer data and any sensitive company data.
And what's the sort of mood of the team about AI. I can't figure out whether people are more excited or more scared about what AI is going to do in the long term.
I think it's a mix of both, probably. I think, the immediate reaction, I think if you look at a macro level at the company was sort of, is AI going to take away my job? Am I going to be out of a job if we use this? We're all being told to use this. And I think what we're seeing is as we use it more and more, I think people are getting more comfortable with it and those fears are subsiding. Because, I mean, in the example I used with the human who's had to check that media relations inbox all day, that's not the most fulfilling use of time, right? And so if we can automate that, it's not that that person is leaving. We can now put that person to do more interesting, stimulating, extra additional incremental things. So I think the more people are using it, and the company has done a very good job from the top down. Our CEO is a big, advocate of technology. So from the early days, trainings for our employees, making everyone have AI goals. And I was scared in the beginning. I'm like, I'm not a technologist. How am I going to teach all of my people how to use this technology? But as we've gone on the journey, people are getting more comfortable. And we built a team within communications that is focused on innovation for us so they work with our technology teams, get counsel from our technology teams, help build these tools, look at these tools, look at what we need, and then train us on them. And so the more we're seeing it and using it, it was kind of scary at first, but when you see its capabilities, I think people are getting really excited about what it can do.
And are you broadly sort of excited for the future of the corporate communications function, both at Booking and generally? Do you see greater challenges and greater opportunities going forward? How are you looking at the future of this business?
I think you said it best is more opportunities and more challenges, and they come hand in hand, and with challenge comes opportunity. I'm incredibly excited. I love being in communications. You do so much work in real time. The world is gone are the days where the news came out in the morning, you read it, and then the next news came out the next day. News is happening everywhere, all around, channels everywhere. Questions are coming in, customers, media can contact you anywhere in real time. And so that comes with risk and challenge because you have to be nimble. You no longer can take an entire day before you respond to something. So the stakes are higher, but it's incredibly energizing. It's incredibly satisfying when you actually are realizing you're communicating in real time all over the world with people, your customers, your partners, your investors, the media who need and want to know and understand things about your brand. So I think, and it's also the role of communications has been, just continues to increase in prominence and significance in an organization because organizations are now required to speak more on things. How do you speak on things? One step the wrong way can, put your, consumers stop using your products, your stock price goes in the toilet. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to continue to give guidance to the business. So I'm excited and energized. It's overwhelming even talking about it, but there would be more channels, more questions, more conversations happening in the future, and how we continue to effectively figure out how to do that is a challenge. But I have a great team of people, and we love, the opportunity to figure it out.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, obviously you are a technology company, but you're also a technology company that's sort of very embedded in the travel and leisure sector. And a few years ago, I might have thought that travel and leisure was, if you'll forgive me, a sort of leisurely, easygoing business, but it's now on the front lines of so much of what's going on in the world
Yeah.
that it must be a fascinating position to view the business from.
Absolutely. We always say that the technology piece, which is what we power, is, evolving at the speed of light and what customers want. I mean, you'd love to be able just to go into, wherever did you want, or voice on your phone, plan me the perfect vacation. I want to go here, and then boom, it's done, right? The technology will be there one day. And so the technology side is moving at the speed of light and is very frantic. Then when you actually get to your vacation, that's the leisurely and relaxing part. And that's, lives in either the destination that you're at and the locals and the restaurants and the hotels. But yeah, our world is very frantic and crazy and getting that technology perfect so that, the leisure side of things can happen for our travelers when they get there.
Great. Well, thank you, Leslie. It's been lovely to chat, find out a little bit about Booking Holdings and your role there. Sounds like you're having fun. And thanks for your time.
Yes, thanks, Paul. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Please.
You've been listening to the Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.